Good morning, everybody. So, as I've mentioned in previous weeks, I am taking my remaining talks of this year, 2024, to explain the major elements of our practice vision. So, we've seen the diagram. We know that there are four major elements to that. So far we've talked about Zazen and Sanshin. We've talked about Dharma study and Dogen themes. Today, let's talk about work practice, which includes for us two elements. One is nyoho, or the dharma of thusness, and the other is bodhisattva leadership. So we have a lot of ground to cover today related to work practice. So if you have been engaged in our 6 points discussion, in our Sangha stewardship workshops and some of those conversations that have been floating around, then a bit of this is going to be familiar. But I think many of you have not been part of that, and this may be new. So we need to have a shared understanding of this practice vision if we're going to build a solid foundation as a practice community going forward. So work practice at Sanshin, in a nutshell, is an investigation of community. And that's a surprise for a lot of people. When we think about work practice, we don't necessarily think about that as an investigation of community. It's an opportunity to experience carrying out our responsibilities in the world, which is the non-reliance piece, without losing our balance, and that's the interconnected piece. So again, everything we do here comes back to this theme about this balance of non-reliance and interconnectedness. How are we separate, standing on our own feet, walking on our own legs, and how are we also completely not separate from other beings, the rest of the Sangha, the things that are happening. So work practice, we are not helping out around the temple, right? We are not offering our time or our expertise to something which is outside of ourselves. So, we don't do this with some expectation about receiving gratitude, having an ego boost, right? We are not working so that at some later point it will be possible for us to practice. Let's do this thing today so that tomorrow we can practice. Not what's happening here. We are simply actively engaging with the Sangha in this time, in this place, discovering what it means to be part of Indra's net. What does it mean to be part of this network of interconnectedness? So doing work within the Sangha means that our practice is reflected back to us in a very direct way. This is a known community, right? We know each other. We do something, we get a reflection pretty quickly about the effect, the impact that we're having by doing that activity. So we get a real sense of cause and effect, right? What we're putting out there into the network of all living beings. We get a real sense quite immediately within the Sangha about how that's working, right? What we're doing. So we may read and discuss texts as part of our study activities. We certainly do that. We're kind of known for that here. Our work activities are where we really experience those teachings with this body and mind. So some of our study can feel a little bit abstract, a little bit opaque. When it comes to work practice, that's where the rubber hits the road, man. That's where practice really comes alive in this body and mind. So this is a very practical study of interconnectedness and the nature of community and what it feels like, what it is actually like to be part of Indra's net. Of course, there's no time when we're not part of that network, but somehow work practice in a practice community gives us some direct connection, direct feeling of that. So whether that community is the practitioners in the temple, the beings in the entire 10-direction world, there's something interesting happening there. There's some interesting practice happening there. So when we're working inside the temple, we are studying the three minds. So when we're working outside the temple in the world, we're studying the three pure precepts. Now that's a bit of an artificial distinction, right? Because there's no time we're not studying all of those things. But somehow inside the temple, we have this really wonderful set of dharma gates where we can talk about the three minds. And outside the temple, we are never not practicing with the three pure precepts. So inside the temple, we're doing things like morning soji. We're cleaning up, we're sweeping floors, ringing bells, taking care of the altar, maybe cooking meals during retreats. Maybe we're teaching zazen, right? There's also the heavier work that's involved with maintaining the buildings, the temple buildings, the grounds, administrative activities, serving on the board, managing registrations, managing our money, all of those things, right? Physically applying and experiencing those teachings is a really important part of Zen training. So in the Senmon Soto, in the training temple, there are temple officers that are taking care of leadership functions on a day-to-day basis. So they are people like the Ino. Today, Esho is serving as our Inos, overseeing what happens in the temple, in the Zendo. We have a tenzo who's in charge of the kitchen. We have a work leader who's managing our work practice, right? There are designated leadership positions for certain functions. So other people might be in charge of managing the vegetable garden or taking care of the guests or doing the other things that need to happen in the temple. But regardless of what your job is, what your responsibility is, and those rotate, regardless of what you're on the hook for, everybody participates in morning and afternoon work period, right? Doesn't matter what job you have in the temple. Supposedly everyone from the head teacher on down. Sometimes the head teacher has to do something else, but typically it's everybody. So it's not possible to just sit zazen all day and do nothing else and survive as a community, right? Somebody has to clean the bathroom. Somebody has to cook the food, right? Somebody's got to take care of the buildings. So work is necessary on a practical level, as well as being a really important dharma gate. So often I either take people with me to Japan or I see people go to Japan and they have this preconceived idea about what practice in a temple is like. They're going to spend all day on a purple cloud, drinking tea, sitting zazen, enjoying the scenery, right? And then they get there and they're shocked because as soon as you get there, the tour bus pulls up with 50 older people in bucket hats that need a sit-down tent on lunch. They need a small dharma talk. They need to chant the Heart Sutra, and they want to look at all the treasures in the temple. And you just go, where am I? Right? Nobody's there to sit on a purple cloud and look at the scenery, right? It is very practical. I mean, there's things that have to get done. So work practice is critical, both just to survive as a temple and also just for our own practice development, for our development of our own wisdom and compassion and insight. So work practice supports this temple community as a kind of a miniature network. So each person's practice is supporting the practice of everybody else, right? If nobody's cooking meals, then nobody can ring bells and nobody can sit zazen and nobody can cut the grass. So this network of activity includes everybody from the head practice leaders on down. So in addition to this individual work practice, all these little nodes in the network, there's also only one activity going on, and it is the entire connected activity of everybody in the Sangha in the temple. There's only one thing happening. So it's kind of like chanting liturgy. You know, we've all got individual voices. If we listen, we can hear each other individually. But when we put them together, there's only one sound. If we're all chanting that sutra, I can hear Myogen and I can hear Esho and I can hear, right? But also, there's one sound. Both of those things are 100% true all the time. So doing all this immerses us in this practical study of Sanshin, three minds, right? The thing for which this temple was named. So these three minds, Dogen, of course, teaches us about these in the Tenzo Kyokan: magnanimous mind, nurturing mind, joyful mind. So Dogen says that a person working to benefit all beings needs to cultivate and maintain and manifest these three minds. So magnanimous mind is like an ocean or like a mountain, calm, steady, right? Accepting, nourishing all beings, all situations without differentiation, without distinction. The ocean is, we say things like, you know, the ocean is serene because it accepts all the water coming in from all the rivers. It makes no distinction. It doesn't say, I'll take yours and not yours, right? So the ocean is a wonderful example of magnanimous mind. Nurturing mind is literally old mind, right? So this is like the attitude of the kindly grandmother or the parent who really delights in taking care of the children or taking care of others. So to me, this is the bodhisattva spirit of a really mature practitioner, right? You can put the self-clinging over here and simply take care of others who are in front of you. Joyful mind is the joy that comes up for us even in the midst of difficulty, frustration, annoyance, confusion, right? This is what arises from the insights of Zazen. We live together with all beings. We're not separate from all beings. When we sit zazen, we open the hand of thought. We drop off body and mind. Those things become very clear, right? And there is a joy that happens with that. We drop a certain amount of suffering because we drop a certain amount of clinging, and there's a joyful mind that naturally arises. So this is our approach. This is what happens when our thoughts are wholesome. If our thoughts are unwholesome, of course, we have greed, anger, and ignorance, the three poisons. This is the basis of all of our suffering, the basis of all of our delusion. Greed, anger, and ignorance. This is the opposite of Sanshin, three minds. So this is, again, what causes suffering for ourselves and others. And it's the opposite of the insight we gain from practicing with three minds, seeing non-separation, seeing interconnectedness, right? So in the same way that the work inside the temple is the gateway to the study of those three minds, magnanimous, nurturing, joyful, activities outside the temple are a gateway to the study of the three precepts, three pure precepts. So we have Shoditsugi Kai, the precept of avoiding all evil acts, or sometimes we say the precept of embracing moral codes. Shozen Bokai, precept of doing all good acts, or embracing all good dharmas. Shoshu Jokai, the precept of embracing and benefiting beings. So we try to do good things, avoid unwholesome things, embrace all beings. So taking care of our families, going to work, doing our jobs, our professions, maybe doing some volunteer work in the community, all of that is practice. All of that is work practice. And we can take our three pure precepts into that container. So these are concrete ways to apply the precept of embracing all beings. So now this is not just the practitioners within the temple. This is not just your Sangha friends. This is the neighborhood. This is society as a whole. This is plants and animals and mountains and rocks and everything. There's no sort of outer edge to our work practice. So Todo-san has said, this is the way we understand that the Dharma is not a theory. The Dharma is not a philosophy. It's not something abstract that lives up here away from us somewhere, right? This is something which is concrete and very real in our moment-by-moment life. So when we have some clarity about the nature of reality, then all of our activity, whether it's inside the temple with the Sangha, outside the temple at work, becomes not only practice, but skillful action. Excuse me. So what is skillful action? Skillful action is something that moves us, and we hope others, toward understanding two important and related things. One is interconnectedness, the other is cause and effect. These two things are really critical for us. So interconnection means there is nothing outside of Buddha's way. We can travel forever and never get to the edge of Buddha's way, right? What in our lives, what in our experience, what in this universe of total functioning is outside of Buddha's way? Cause and effect is important because it reminds us what we do has consequences for others and for all beings and for ourselves. So this is a foundational teaching in Buddhism, right? This is certainly for Dogen. This is one of the key things, cause and effect. Actually, you know, it's what Shakyamuni woke up to under the tree. He was looking for some insight into the nature of suffering. What is suffering and how does it happen? There's our very first, most basic instance of teachings about cause and effect, right? Suffering has a cause. He realizes suffering has a cause. It's not something random, which is visited on us from somewhere else, right? Our suffering has a cause. When we deal with the cause, we deal with the suffering. So we need to look carefully at the nature of that. If we're not perpetuating greed, anger, ignorance, three poisons for ourselves and for others, or if we're helping to put an end to those things in the world, then suffering ceases, right? There's a very direct line, and we can trace that. So, our challenge is always how best to take this practice that we cultivate inside the temple out into this world on fire, right? Through work practice, usually. Our work practice helps others, and in turn, that work practice helps us deepen our own insights and our own understanding into how this universe functions, how suffering happens, what are we doing with this body and mind. So one important way that happens is by transforming our understanding or our experience of interconnectedness. So those that have the practice diagram and have looked at it, you can see that at least for the next few years, our work practice is going to encompass these two main areas: nyoho, or engaging with the dharma of thusness, and bodhisattva leadership. And both of these are practices for both inside the temple and outside the temple. So we can do these in the temple with the Sangha. We can also take these out the door into the rest of our lives. So let's start with nyoho. Nyo is thusness or suchness, and ho is dharma. So practicing with nyoho is practicing with an attitude of modesty. That's the way I would summarize it. We're practicing with an attitude of modesty, not about self-clinging. So Tomoe Katagiri taught nyoho robe sewing in North America for many decades. She's quite well known among those who know about sewing. So she wrote, "How to take care of our life as a disciple of Buddha is a great problem for us and a great practice for us. If we always put ourselves into the modest life as a disciple of Buddha, naturally this modest attitude will appear in our clothing, food, and housing. However, we are prone to the excessive pursuit of fine material, beautiful colors, and unique style. This sense of seeking after beauty is not wrong. However, it often invites jealousy, contempt, stealing, and the desire for luxury. In order not to cause even a little trace of these mistakes to arise, disciples of Buddha needed to take the most faithful care to embody the formless Buddha's teaching. So as she says in Soto Zen, there are said to be three faces of nyoho, three faces of the dharma of thusness: food, clothing, and shelter. So as you can see, this is a really practical, very concrete study of the dharma, right? And at the same time, there are some really, really deep teachings that go way beyond food, clothing, and shelter, right? So in the original teachings, of course, clothing meant okesa, clothing meant robes, because they were talking to monks. So they were talking about what are the practice clothes that you're wearing. Food meant meals taken using oryoki, using a set of eating bowls and doing that in a formal way, certain forms and chants. Shelter meant the zendo or the sodo, right? Where are you practicing? So food, clothing, and shelter, very much about practice itself. And today, of course, we still wear rakusu, we still wear okesa, we still take meals during sesshin using that set of bowls, using those oryoki forms. We still practice in the zendo or in the sodo, right? So we're still in direct touch with those practices. On that basis, we can also apply nyoho teachings to everyday life outside of here. So this is a place to cultivate, to study, to gain some insight about these things. But this, I'm always saying to people, don't check your practice at the door. How do we then take that out into the world? Because we're all eating and wearing clothes and living somewhere every day. So Mrs. Katagiri goes on, when doing zazen for even a minute, we are Buddha. Dogen Zenji mentioned the same teaching concerning the okesa in Keisakudoku. The okesa is Buddha's robe, the robe is Buddha's body is Buddha Dharma, and the Buddha Dharma is the okesa itself. The same idea is applied to the meaning of the okesa, oryoki, and the sodo, the place where we practice zazen. In terms of the external representation, the sodo is regarded as housing, the okesa as clothing, and oryoki as food. Each of them has a different form, but they are exactly the same. Isn't that interesting? So within each of these three faces of nyoho, we're going to break it down a little more. There are three aspects of, I guess I would call it, appropriateness. There's color, or tai, there's materials, or shiki, and there's size or amount, which is ryo. So color, materials, amount. Those are the three things we need to think about when we are practicing with food, clothing, and shelter. So already we've got it, we can draw a chart in our minds, right? There's lots to chew on, lots to dig into there. So each of those three aspects needs to be in accord with the Dharma. So we're going to hear a lot more about those in the coming year. I could spend a lot of time right now, I'm not going to, right? Because that's where we're going to, as a Sangha, we're going to get to like chew on stuff, right? Which is going to be really cool. So these guidelines of nyoho go all the way back through the monastic codes, through the rules of purity or the shingi, all the way back to the Indian Vinaya. So these are really, really old teachings. This larger context then gives us a chance to study thusness with body and mind. And I think it makes nyoho relevant and meaningful, even if we are not particularly that day the ones engaged in cooking the meal for sesshin, or sewing, the rakusu, or building a temple, or working on the zendo, right? Everyone wears food, everyone eats clothes. Everyone eats clothes. Everyone wears clothes, everyone eats food, everyone lives somewhere. Yes. So Sanshin, of course, inherits this connection with nyoho quite directly because of Sawaki Roshi. So Todo-san's teacher's teacher's teacher, right? Sawaki Roshi was one of the leaders of the 20th century nyoho movement in Japan. He was instrumental in making sure people were aware of these teachings and practices and sharing them around. So we have a very direct lineage connection with these teachings. So he was particularly involved with clothing and robe sewing, but as a Sangha, we're going to be looking at all of those faces and all of those aspects and applying those teachings to everything. So in a nutshell, that's where we're headed with nyoho. You can see there's lots of really interesting, cool stuff to chew on. So bodhisattva leadership. Switching to part number 2. Inspiring and guiding others toward awakening is what I would call that. And you might think you're not a bodhisattva leadership or you're not involved with leadership here, and I will beg to differ. So it's easy to get so caught up in the work practice as weeding, work practice as washing dishes, work practice as, pounding nails, that we can forget about the essential work of actually leading the community. That is essential work practice too. So there's both formal and informal leadership in a Sangha. Simply being a bodhisattva, I would argue, is itself a leadership position. Simply committing to this practice, whether you've done that, in your heart with Buddha or in some kind of a public ceremony, simply committing to do this practice makes you a bodhisattva leader. I'm sorry. Right? So, again, I think this is an area that's relevant to everybody, whether or not we have a title or a specific assignment here. Because, we all lead families, corporations, sports teams, committees, ourselves. We all lead something, even if it's a short-term project team. So, how do we take our practice into that leadership? So if we serve as directors or staff in the Dharma Center, then we're making sure that this temple is operating, what? According to thusness, according to the Dharma. So again, here's a direct connection with nyoho. How are we making decisions? How are we executing decisions? We have a couple of board members in the room. They know they have 4 main areas of responsibility. They have the ambassadorial piece, the policy setting piece, the human resources piece, and the stewardship piece. That's what board members do. So they're paying attention to things like, how do we communicate? How do we make decisions? How do we carry out decisions? How are we managing this building, our people, our resources, our money, our time? They're making sure we've got the right people in the right places doing the right things with the right skills. That sounds corporate, and if you overlay Dharma on top of that, you go, no, you know what? That's practice. How do we make decisions is nothing but ethics. How do we communicate is nothing but right speech, right? I mean, you can very directly apply all your practice, all your Dharma study onto leadership. So all those things make sure this temple functions legally and competently as a nonprofit corporation in North America. That is part of our identity. We need to take care of that. And they're also making sure it functions according to thusness, functions according to the Dharma. But we also, of course, need practice leadership from both lay and ordained Sangha. We need to train novices as the next generation of Dharma leaders, wise and compassionate Dharma leaders, I hope. Sanshin is one of the relatively few Dharma centers in North America, temples in North America, that's recognized by the Soto Zen denomination. So we have a really important entry point for practitioners who aspire to carry this tradition and carry this legacy in a very particular way. But there's also, of course, practice leadership from everybody else. You don't need to ordain. You don't need to sew a robe. You don't even need to, do lay precepts. Anytime you are making tea, ringing bells, resetting the zendo, right, taking care of altars, cooking meals, greeting visitors, teaching zazen, all of that is practice leadership. All of that is bodhisattva leadership. One of the things you may know that's been important to me since I took this chair, since I arrived here, has been developing shared leadership. I wanted to make sure that this temple wasn't resting on the back of any one individual, any one person. I wanted to make sure it would be able to go forward even if one or more practice leaders were not available for whatever reason, right? That happens when you build a strong Sangha and you build a strong community. So this is one of the reasons why I'm spending this much time talking with everybody, right, about the practice vision, because we've all got a piece of this thing. We've all got to carry this thing together because we're all carrying the life of the Sangha. This is not up to a few people with titles, right? This is everybody's practice. So Sangha engagement, really important, both for our individual practice development and for the health of the community. So engaging with the Sangha is really going to support us in developing wisdom and compassion and insight and practicing zazen and all of that. So individually, that engagement is important. But our engagement is also important in making sure that the Sangha has a life, right? That the Sangha is functioning and that the practice is happening. So, if I get trampled by elephants tomorrow, I'm fond of saying, this place will go on and probably no one will notice. Yes, right? Because, we have leadership in various areas shared across the Sangha. So it's not about any one person. Everyone is important, and also, right, the place goes on. So I've seen what happens in Sanghas where this kind of shared leadership is not in place, and I will tell you it is not pretty. It is not a good thing. So when I see those things happening, I am so grateful for this Sangha and for these practitioners who step up and participate and take leadership and commit. It's the reason we have a really healthy Sangha here. So both Buddha and Dogen had plenty to say about leadership. I'm not making this up, right? We can look to our ancestors for guidance about these things. The newest version of the practice vision, which is not the one you have in front of you, actually includes Buddha's 10 qualities of a good leader. So I want to say a word about those here today, even though you don't have them right in front of you now. They are certainly around. I have introduced them to like board members. So they're in the air. So Buddha starts with good old dana, or generosity, is the first of these 10, right? In this context, it's about selflessness. It's about being prepared to put the interests of the community, the sangha, above self-interest. So, if you come from the world of nonprofit boards, this is the duty of loyalty. So it also means transparent communications, transparent decision-making, not being stingy with information, not being stingy with involvement, right? All of that is generosity. How do we lead? With sort of an open hand. Second one is morality. Now we get hung up on a word like morality. All it means is acknowledging interconnectedness, right? All it means is the things I do affect other beings. And we've already heard that. That's simple interconnectedness, right? So interconnectedness from the 3 marks of existence. So it's just recognizing we have some responsibility for ourselves and for other beings and for what we're doing and for the impact that we're having on other beings. So in the first of the 3 pure precepts, we vow to embrace all moral codes. So here we are again, right? That means precepts. It also means governmental laws. It means social rules. It means whatever policies we have on the books as a community. So we're not just running roughshod, right? Third one is altruism. This is being concerned with the well-being of others at least as much as we're concerned with the well-being of ourselves. So this is disinterested selflessness. This is not based on social relationships. I'm going to get something from you if I help you. This is not based on getting a reward. This is simply seeing what needs to happen as a bodhisattva, as Avalokiteshvara does, 1,000 hands, right, and doing what needs to be done. Fourth one is honesty. So we can say this is related to the 4th precept about avoiding false speech, right? It's also related to maintaining integrity, which means having a high moral character. It also means wholeness, not being divided. Good old non-separation. Here we are again, right? So we can see how this is about authenticity. This is about sincerity. It's about being the same toward everybody. I like you, so I'm going to treat you well, and I don't like you, so I'm not going to treat you so well, right? Communicating consistent messages. Is everyone getting the same information? The 5th one is gentleness. So this is about moderation, right, with body, speech, and mind, because after all, Buddhism is the middle way. So moderation, not going overboard in various ways, maintaining balance in the sangha, in the community, treating people kindly, shelving the harshness and the arrogance and whatever impulse we might have. 6th one is self-control. So we're working diligently, responsibly to make sure the sangha has what it needs. Practitioners have what they need, but we're not getting caught in this spiral of thinking that the place needs to be bigger and fancier and richer and better and, right, clinging to some idea, more famous. So if we do that, we risk falling over into greed rather than maintaining a simple, clear, wise, compassionate life. 7th one is non-anger. So we're going to keep our equanimity even when things are going off the rails. You stub your toe, you lose your keys. A tree falls on your house. Non-anger. We're doing our best to work sincerely, even with people who irk us, and there will be some. Even in, I don't know a sangha where, there isn't somebody who irks somebody who annoys somebody. Because we're human beings, we have karmic characteristics, right? So even in the face of that, can we keep our cool? 8th one is nonviolence. So this is about not taking revenge. So violence is force. It's meant to hurt. It's meant to kill. It's meant to do damage. All of those things are violations of the precepts. It is not the way we lead, right? So when another sangha poaches your people, some other group spreads information about you, right? Staying calm, being skillful, not taking revenge. 9th one is forbearance, sometimes called patience. Golly, things take time. Have I had a lesson in patience? Things take time. Plans need time to come to fruition. We may have the greatest idea in the world for what the sangha needs, or how we should teach the dharma, or something, right? Plans take time. It takes time to collect resources. It takes time for others to think through what you're suggesting, come to conclusion. Those conclusions may or may not be the same as yours. We should sit 25 minutes instead of 50 minutes. Okay. Well, there needs to be conversation about that, right? So people need time to come to their own acceptance, to come to their own place, right? So things we set in motion during our time as bodhisattvas may not actually come to pass until life after life after life, right? The things, the stage that we're setting in North America, the foundation we're building for Soto Zen in North America, I wish I was going to be alive 150 years from now to see what happens, right? Because I'm involved at the national level in building this thing. I would love to see what that looks like in 150 years. Nonetheless, we know tomorrow is right here. So what are we doing right now? The patience, the skill, the care we take in our practice right now is what enables the next layer of bodhisattvas on the next one and the next one. 10th and last one is uprightness. So we're going to respect the opinions of others, the input of others. That means Sangha, staff, directors, practitioners. We're going to use that to promote harmony and prevent what Dogen called disorder in the way. You know, he says, do not cause disorder in the way. So I'd also add here respecting the practice of others, which may be different than our center's practice vision. We're the only ones in North America that have a vision that looks exactly like that. That doesn't mean this is the one true way. We're often in contact with people who practice in other Buddhist traditions, in other lineages, in other ways. Good for them. We respect that. It's all Buddhist practice. It's one big tent. Dogen would have said there is only one Buddhism and only one Zazen, and we're all doing the same practice, right? So as I say, I've already introduced board members to those 10 Buddhist 10 qualities of a good ruler. It's not up to me to convince them to follow them. It's, you know, I've just simply made them available. I've introduced practice leaders to Dogen's instructions for temple administrators. I think we're going to spend a little time on the Hachidainin Gaku. I hear there's some talk in the air about 8 awarenesses of great people and how we're going to look into that. So we can see that work practice is not separate in any way from Zazen, Dharma study, ritual, the rest of the elements on this practice vision. So our study makes us stronger leaders. Our leadership activities help develop our practice insight. So this is very much jujutsu. This is total dynamic functioning, right? Everything is helping, supporting, affecting everything else. All of this is an investigation of self without relation to others that includes everything, which is our core. So we take those insights with us out of the temple, into our work lives, into the family, the workplace, the community, the classroom, wherever we are, right? So what exactly is, after all that, bodhisattva leadership? I would argue or suggest that it is working with questions like, what can I do with my own karmic body, speech, and mind to create or help to maintain a sustainable situation here that keeps the practice of Buddhas and ancestors alive in the world? What can I do to make sure that this place, this community is sustainable and is embodying and enabling the practice of Buddhas? And that's what keeps Buddhas and ancestors alive, right? That's what keeps them here. How do I help make sure that that practice is still going on 100 years from now? Because 100 years from now is today, right? How do I make sure that practice continues to unfold, that the Dharma continues to be available? That doesn't necessarily mean continues to be available in a temple. That could mean, how do I take my practice into the world with other beings and simply put into that network wisdom, compassion, clear seeing, right? How does this go on? So leadership is usually associated with power. So in a Dharma center, that can be a charged word, right? That can be a bit of a, people can be uncomfortable with things like leadership because you associate it with power. Usually when we think about leadership, well, that's the ability or maybe the right to control people, resources, outcomes, to produce a certain kind of effect, right? And all these other ideas get mixed in there like authority, influence, energy, efficacy, force, right? So that's a really interesting balance in a Dharma center. People don't like to be told how to practice, and also, right? There's leadership that is skillful, and then there's leadership that feels self-clinging, and so bodhisattva leadership is a really important Dharma study. So I think bodhisattva leadership is the kind of leadership that every practitioner embodies. Everybody exercises this simply by doing the practice, demonstrating living by vow, standing upright in the world, right? Carrying your practice with you, It's what allows us to make good decisions, moment by moment by moment, for ourselves, for others, on a micro scale, on a macro scale. Make good decisions at home. And if you're involved in a big organization or on a national level, you make big decisions, on a macro level. There is no bodhisattva in my world who's not a leader. So everybody here in my world is a leader. So I think bodhisattvahood and leadership can't be separated. That's what makes this a really critical study for all of us. So one important aspect of leadership is helping to create wholesome conditions for awakening. How do we create wholesome conditions for manifesting awakening, being in touch with that, bringing it into the world? That can mean hitting the han, it can be leading chanting, it can be giving dharma talks, it can mean serving on a committee, serving on the board. Simply taking your cushion and sitting zazen. One of the themes of our Sangha life here at Sanshin is that we aspire to understand our practice and practice our understanding. What does that mean, right? That is a really useful, Reader's Digest statement, nutshell statement, right? We want to understand our practice and practice our understanding. So that means it's not enough to just read a lot of books about leadership, right? How to run a successful nonprofit. That might be helpful, but we also need to demonstrate our understanding of Sangha, community, interconnectedness through our practice. It means showing up here or just in your life, but it means showing up, right? What are we carrying? What are we demonstrating? So for the bodhisattva, the aspiration to lead comes from the aspiration to serve. These things are very closely tied. So if as leaders we simply want the power, we want to be in charge, we want to tell people what to do, we want to, manage the money, whatever that is, we want to be seen as insiders, that's about greed, anger, and ignorance, right? We're back to the three poisons. Is that really bodhisattva leadership, or is that my ego standing up and saying, I want people to, see me a certain way, or I want to have control of something? So, bodhisattvas serve because they want to make it possible for people to practice now and in the future. When we took vows, when we decided to practice, I'm sure our first impulse was, I want to ameliorate my own suffering. I want to take this thing up because I want to know what my own suffering is about. And then very quickly, as soon as you got in the zendo and somebody taught you to sit, you figured it out. Oh, this isn't only about me. Practice cannot only be about me because I'm not separate, right? So, how does my practice support the practice of others? How do I as a bodhisattva enable the practice of others? So we are bodhisattvas, I think, bodhisattvas enabling the cultivation of bodhisattvas. That's what happened when we took vows, whether that was private or public, right? That's what happened. So leaders, of course, need followers if they're going to lead. So the Sangha, of course, is free to choose who to listen to, who to take direction from. Folks are free to come and go at any time. We don't lock the door once you're in here. You can come once and never come back. You can choose to do that. So as bodhisattva leaders, we need to take needs, input, ideas from the Sangha, combine those as leaders with our own karmic circumstances, because we might have a particular area of expertise, or we might be particularly mature in the practice or something, right? So we need to take that input, combine it with what we bring to that conversation as bodhisattvas, and then do real life concrete things. Something has to happen, right? These things demonstrate our values, our judgment, our competence, our ethics, our precepts. So bodhisattva leaders hold wisdom and compassion in balance, and that is a real challenge. And here's why this is a challenge. I think this is really interesting. So as a result of practice, a bodhisattva arouses great compassion for all beings, right? They know about the origin of suffering. They hear the cries of all the beings that are caught up in the samsaric world, having suffering of various kinds, or in the grip of the three poisons. They can see that this is a characteristic of this sort of karmic human form. Liberation is not so easy. How do we open the hand, right? How do we let go of our suffering? So these bodhisattvas feel great compassion for beings, for humans and for beings. So that goes up. And at the same time, because of wisdom, they know these five skandhas are empty. There is nobody to be saved. There is no suffering happening here. There's nobody for whom they need to feel compassion. And so as the wisdom comes up, then the compassion goes down. And it's like a set of scales. And then as soon as that compassion starts to drop, then immediately they're again aware of the cries of the world, compassion comes back up. So this is how the bodhisattva moves through the world, moving between wisdom and compassion, right? Seeing, oh, beings are empty, there's no one to save. And at the same time, beings are suffering. Compassion arises, we need to liberate beings. Both of those things are 100% true all the time. What an interesting way to lead. So when we're running a nonprofit or running a temple in this samsaric world, we see this kind of thing all the time, right? We have to balance people's emotional needs with rational needs. We want everybody to feel heard, but we also know not everybody's going to get everything they want all the time. You can't survive as a community that way. So, right, how do we balance that? In a religious community, we also balance personal growth with organizational growth. So in other words, sometimes in a temple, we will do the less efficient thing because that might allow people to deepen their practice. But we do that with intention, right? We know what we're doing. We don't do that because we don't have work leaders or because we're disorganized or we don't know how to do something, right? So, I mean, we could just say, well, let's just have Esho cook all the meals. Let's have Hoshin lead every Sunday because they know what they're doing and that's the most efficient thing, and then mistakes won't get made and everything will be fine, right? Well, okay, but then nobody else ever gets to do those practices. Nobody else ever gets to learn about nyoho cooking. Nobody else ever gets to learn about, how to lead on a Sunday. Not the way to have a solid community. And then, of course, what happens to the Sangha? When Esho's not available, everybody starves. When Hoshin's not here, there's no Sunday practice, right? Doesn't work well. So yes, mistakes will be made. As we're learning to do things, as we are sharing work, as we're training each other, as we're taking on different responsibilities, mistakes are going to be made, yes. The Sangha will feel those mistakes, yes. And that is the compassion we have for each other in a community. If I'm learning to do something and I make a mistake, you're going to feel it. And I hope wisdom and compassion are going to arise and someone's going to say, somebody's learning that. They'll get it right next time. So we need to not be slapdash in how we're learning, but at the same time, right? We hold each other as a community. Let's develop together. This is what it means to work and practice in a human community. So showing up to practice means we're supporting everybody's development. It's one reason why your practice is not all about you. Leaders need someone to lead if they're going to lead, right? She needs somebody to be sitting if she's going to ring a bell. So we need to show up in order to enable everybody's leadership and everybody's practice. This is why your engagement matters. If it's not your turn to lead today, you're making it possible for somebody else to lead, and tomorrow it'll be your turn to do whatever, and you will be glad someone's here to practice with you. So I think back to the days, early on, it was in the mornings, it was often Todo-san and a Jikido, and those were the only ones that were here. And it's hard to lead that way, right? So show up. It makes a difference. We all need to develop leadership together. So as we go forward, I encourage you, intersect in your mind these two areas of practice, this nyoho dharma of thusness piece and the bodhisattva leadership piece. There are so many interesting connections between those two things. So as we go forward, think about how those things are connected. For instance, I see a real connection between the modesty of nyoho and the middle way that the Buddha is describing in his 10 characteristics of good rulers, right? There's something really important and interesting about that middle way. Nyoho is a manifestation of what he's talking about. How do we do that, right? So there's some interesting stuff there. I think it contributes to an overall approach to our practice, which I hope is going to give us a good foundation going forward. That is too much from me. What would you all like to say or ask about work practice, nyoho, nyoho-e, bodhisattva leadership? I'm going to start with people in the room, and then I'm going to ask Will to facilitate people at home. Things folks would like to say here, whether you're a leader at this moment or feel that you are, or a worker, or not.
So we'll take a question and a comment from this room first.
Yeah, let's start here.
If anybody has a question, comment, please raise your hand and speak.
I've stunned everybody into silence. Mark,
yeah, I guess one of the things that just kind of, and I don't know if I have a question as much as just an observation. I think
reflections are good.
A reflection is, I was
Right.
And then try to engage in that kind of way. And I find it sometimes really difficult to be able to sort of get into that mindset, or to develop as a habit that this work is bodhisattva work.
Sure. And I think you can approach that as bodhisattva work in more than one way. So I think if you're on a board or doing work in your office, you're at the university, you're not in a temple, right? So there is the whole thing about what attitude am I bringing to the actual tasks? And then I think there's something really helpful that says, what am I embodying in the world? What example am I setting for coworkers and people I may encounter? Now, you don't want to do that in a holier than thou way. I'm here to convert you all to Buddhism. No, man, no. Not a teachable moment. However, if you move through the world in a certain way, it's really interesting how people respond to you, right? If you don't head out with, some kind of looking for trouble, guess what? That's not what's reflected back to you, right? So I think there's I think there's so many opportunities with bodhisattva leadership, so many dharma gates, right? At least those two. Like, what attitude am I actually bringing to the tasks, and then what am I embodying in this meeting, or in this committee, or as I walk down the hall, or I used to work for the government. I worked for the government for a long time, and I took my practice to work. I mean, here, and I used to have people come into my office and sit down and say, "Your office is so serene." I was in the midst of chaos, But there was something about like bringing that container along, and of course, separating church and state. Nobody wanted me practicing my religion in my office, right? But it was a really interesting intersection, and I took it on quite intentionally just to see what would happen. Yeah. So I think what you're raising is like really interesting. That's a really interesting set of dharma gates. Other comments, reflections here? Please.
I was interested in what you said about kind of being able to balance, like having like self-reliance and being independent, but also being interconnected with other people. Could you talk more about that and maybe how you can kind of find that in your life? Yeah.
Well, so that is really the core of not only our practice at Sanshin, that is basic teaching within the Mahayana, right? That there's separate forms, and that all those things are connected. So Toda-san, one of his favorite examples is there's 5 fingers, there's 100% 5 fingers, there's also one hand, and it's 100% one hand. So usually, because we're limited karmic beings, we're going to fall down on one side or the other. We're going to see one side or the other side, and it's hard to see both at the same time. That's why our zazen practice is important. Because when we sit down, we face the wall. The wall is not an object of this person. We open the hand, we drop separation, we just sit. We can sort of put ourselves in that place, so that maybe it gets that much easier when we walk out of the Zendo door to maintain that awareness that there's interconnectedness and that there's also individuality. So, one of our real challenges in this practice is, how do we see that one reality from 2 sides? And then how do we express 2 sides in one action? Which is a phrase you'll hear around here a lot, right? So, is there an easy answer to your question? No, I think that's what our practice is all about. That's why we sit, that's why we practice. I think that's why Sangha can be a wonderful container for sort of getting to grips with those 2 levels of teaching, because as I say, this is a kind of a known quantity. These are our Sangha friends, we do something, it's reflected back. We can kind of wrap our heads around the fact that there's a finite number of beings in this community, and then we go out in the world, right? And how can we take that same attitude, sort of toward all beings, so that we know when we're walking down the street and we think it's just us, well, the things that I'm doing walking down the street are affecting beings because I'm not separate. So those are really important, critical, basic foundational teachings for us. So all I can say is continue to sit, continue to practice. I think that's how we come to be able to see both and hold both of those realities at the same time, because they're 100% true. We want to go, oh, there's this one and then there's this one, and I'm going to hop back and forth. And it's actually, both of these are 100% true all the time, right? So it's a really interesting piece of our practice.
Thank you.
That's an important, if you're going to focus on something, that's an important thing to focus on. Other questions, reflections in the room? Oh, please, Sawyer.
That kind of leads into what I was going to ask, which is that image that you gave of sort of these scales of wisdom and compassion.
Isn't that interesting?
One going up and the other. And I wonder if you might also see wisdom and compassion in a similar way as we see sort of like interconnectedness and individuality. Do you, like, I don't know if it maps perfectly on, but like if you see wisdom as seeing emptiness, seeing that there's no separate selves, so the wisdom side sort of sees interconnectedness, and then the compassion side sees the needs of individual beings in front of us and how we can support and be helpful and in such a way that we're not causing suffering for real people. So do you see those wisdom and compassion sort of together with?
Absolutely. Yeah. They are completely inseparable for all the reasons you've just described, right? If we're seeing clearly, compassion arises naturally. If we're seeing beings clearly, then compassion is right there. If we have compassion for beings, it's because we are seeing the way Buddha sees, right? Which is how the bodhisattva sees it. So provisionally, yes, there's wisdom and compassion, but in the real world, in the real reality, those things are completely interpenetrated, right? So I think we would, as individuals, we each would probably say we are more comfortable with one or the other. I'm very much more a wisdom person than a compassion person. My guess is it may be the opposite for you. I don't know. So then the challenge is, okay, how do I really see that both of those things are here 100% of the time? Right? If we're seeing clearly, we see both of those things. I think it does map on in an interesting way. So, provisionally, we make a distinction that if you're a bodhisattva, that balance is happening anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was interested also to your description of sort of like, sort of if you potentially go too far toward compassion or too far toward wisdom, the other one kind of balances in that, if you're perhaps like really worried about every individual being's suffering or the whole state of the world, that's basically not helpful.
Yeah, you can be paralyzed by that, right?
You're paralyzed, or you're bumbling around because you're so anxious. And so wisdom, seeing that sort of reality is as it is, and all of the suffering is included in that.
Yep.
Sort of gives in my experience, it's almost a relief valve.
Yeah, well, and of course the natural outcome of that is skillful action, right? I mean, what is skillful action other than manifesting wisdom and compassion? So how do I know what to do for all these beings or this one being in front of me? I better have both. Otherwise, as you say, I'm paralyzed because, well, I can't do anything because I can't do everything. I can't save all beings, so I'm not going to save any. Well, no, I'm not a bodhisattva, right? We already know when we took these vows, we were never going to get to the end. We can't possibly, as karmic individuals, save all beings, and yet we vow to save all beings. What the hell are we doing? Right? So we already know. This is why we have vow and repentance. I'm never going to do all the bodhisattva work in the world that I aspire to do. That doesn't mean I shouldn't do what's in front of me right now. So in order to do that skillful action, wisdom and compassion are both there. So all of these things are very much interpenetrated. right? And we have to be careful not to fall down too much on one side or the other. This is why Manjushri has a two-edged sword, right? We can kill people with wisdom. We can be, as smart as we want to be and think we're really doing the very most logical thing, and people can have suffering because of that sometimes. So this is why I say things like, sometimes in order to train people, we do the less efficient thing, which really, in North America, that really puzzles people sometimes. Well, there should just be a handout, and then one person should memorize the handout, and then that should be that person's job forever. Well, what about everybody else? And on one hand, yes, that's very efficient. We will never make a mistake with that person in that job. And then, isn't there some other consideration there? Well, yeah. So, it's a constant balance, which means we're never done. That's why we have our repentance, right? Because we're never done. Other things about that? You're raising some interesting points.
I think I would prefer the metaphor of a gestalt than a scale, because the scale seems to imply that one goes down as the other. Whereas gestalt, like in psychology textbooks, you see the vase or the two faces.
Yep.
Well, if you see the vase, it's not that the two faces isn't there.
Right.
It's just you can focus on the vase and vice versa.
Right.
So compassion and wisdom are two sides of the same gestalt.
Absolutely.
And they're always present.
Yes.
And they're always complementary. Mm-hmm. So we have our three minds, and I have a kind of a simplified version of that. Big heart, big mind, and then joyful mind is what connects the two.
Mm-hmm.
So wisdom and compassion, you can't separate them.
Right.
But you can emphasize one over the other at any given time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. So just like 5 fingers, 1 hand, right? Those things are 100% true all the time. So thank you for that clarification. Yeah, the problem with language, right? As soon as we name something, then there's something that we're not naming. So it's a problem with language. Thank you for clarifying that. Other things in this room? Please.
You've mentioned skillful action, and I've heard the term skillful means many times. Can you explain more about the definition of skillful?
Definition of skillful. So as I mentioned, typically what we're talking about is moving beings toward understanding interconnectedness and cause and effect. So that sounds like way up here, when what you really want to know is, what do I buy at the grocery store? Right? So it's easy for me to say, let's move beings toward interconnectedness and cause and effect. So there's lots of things that factor into that kind of decision, right? But I think, so that could be another whole Dharma talk, and maybe it needs to be one. But I think just in general, if what we're sort of pointing ourselves towards is, how can I ameliorate suffering for the most beings for the longest time in the largest scale, or how can I at least not create more suffering? I think that's the simple way to look at it. Now, that's going to look different for everybody. I'm using buying decisions as an example because that's something we all do. Well, we could argue from now until next week about what's a skillful buying decision. Materials, amount, we're back to nyoho, right? Like, where did it come from? Who did the work? How far did it have to ship to get, right? There's all those considerations which can unfold, right? There's no easy answer to any of that stuff. But I think in general, if what we're thinking about when we're taking an action is, am I at least not perpetuating suffering to the degree that's possible? Or can I lessen suffering in some degree that's possible, right? And what does that require? Letting go of self. So the basis of that is always, letting go of being self-interested. And now we're back to Buddhist 10 qualities of a ruler, right? So there's lots I think you can chew on for that. Skillful action is a big area. I encourage looking into that. Because what are we doing as soon as we leave the Zendo? Making decisions and taking actions like this. Did I see another hand in this room before we move to virtual? Other things here? Will, have we got anybody with something to say at home?
Not so far.
Okay. Well, since it's already 12 minutes past the hour, I'm happy to entertain whatever people would like to do, if there are things out there. Otherwise, if we feel like we're satiated with work for today. All right. Thank you, everybody. So we'll continue to make our way through the practice vision for the next talk. Please, as you're going home and just noodling on this, try to make connections between the dots, because this is how we're, I think, forming a solid community, right? Okay. Thanks, everybody.